Hi, I'm Dove Sinclair with the Power of the Patient Project. My guest today is Dr. David Posen. Dr. Posen was a family doctor of 17 years before giving up his general practice in 1985 to devote his time exclusively to stress management, lifestyle counseling, and psychotherapy. He has spoken widely to education, government, business, and professional groups across North America and Western Europe. Some of his clients have included Warner Brothers, US Steel, Chevron, IBM, and Microsoft. David is also a best-selling author of 5 books: Always Change in a Losing Game, Staying Afloat When the Water Gets Rough, A Little Book of Stress Relief, His Work Is Work Killing You, and Authenticity. He has appeared on many TV and radio shows across Canada and has been quoted in many leading US media outlets such as the Huffington Post, US News and World Report, People's, and McCall's. So welcome, Dr. Posen. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Dove. It's a pleasure.
So first, can you just explain your book, Why is Work Killing You, and what readers might learn from it?
Well, the book was written with great passion, I have to tell you, because I was hearing stories from my patients for years about the stress that they were experiencing in the workplace. In fact, the beginning of the book starts with many patients have told me stories over the years that have made me want to come grab the phone, call their employer and say, stop killing this person. And that's actually how the word killing came into the title of the book. But I was also doing a lot of public speaking, seminars and lectures all across North America. And I was finding that that employers were inviting me to speak, to talk to their employees about managing stress, work-life balance, and so on, managing change. But it was all on them. You know, this is what you need to do, Mr. and Mrs. Miss Employee, in order to manage your stress. But we are still, running a high-paced business, it's fast, high demands, and so on.
Right.
So as a result, I kind of felt like all the onus was on the employee, and the employer wasn't taking as much responsibility. And in fact, they would have surveys, and people would come up to me. I learned a lot from people telling me things at the breaks or after the sessions were over. And they would tell me, we fill out these surveys and they just ignore what we're telling them. So I decided that I had written already 3 books about how to manage change, how to manage stress, and so on. And then I decided I really want to write a book about what the workplace needs to do to stop making people sick in the first place, to stop putting so much stress on them and then saying it's up to you to manage your stress. I think it needed to be a shared responsibility, and that was the basis and the motivation for the book.
Yeah, no, it's really important. Um, and now, what can like a reader learn from it? Is it meant for employees, employers? What's the primary audience?
Well, actually, that's a great question because initially my intended audience was employers, but my publisher, and quite wisely, said to me, "We really need to talk about, what employees can do as well, because if it's a shared responsibility, which I believe it is, then what can employees themselves do?" And so the first thing is that I looked at where, in my mind, what the whole story was about, what the problem is. And so I talked about where the stress is coming from. So too much work, a high workload, too fast a pace, too high expectations, too much pressure, and not enough resources. And this is something I was hearing over and over again. And I would hear it from patients in my office, they kept cutting headcount and then expected those lucky survivors to pick up the slack and pick up all of that work as well. And I had one patient who he had a team of 10 people. They cut him down to 3 and then added another project for him. And so too few resources, big problem. So as a result of that, people were experiencing high stress, working longer hours, excuse me, self-neglect, because when you're working longer hours, you don't have time for adequate sleep, regular exercise, good nutrition, and so on, much less time with friends and family. But but also it was leading to poor coping strategies. People were smoking and drinking and eating comfort foods when they were stressed out instead of maybe meditating or going for a bike ride or something.
Mhm.
And so the net of that is that people were getting sick, physically sick, but it also was affecting mood and mostly depression. I mean, anxiety and depression. I see both in my practice. It's interesting. A lot of people think of stress management as only anxiety. At least half my patients actually present with depression. Um, it was affecting relationships and strain in the family. I mean, when you're highly stressed at work, you come home, you're not your best self when you greet your family. And lastly, I think, well, not lastly, second lastly, bad behavior. I think when people are highly stressed, they don't behave well. A lot of the abuse in the workplace, I think, isn't from venal, mean-spirited people. It's from people who are just so highly stressed, they're not handling it well. But the irony of all of this is that it decreases productivity.
Mhm.
I was asked about my title of my book is work, and I was asked, can work really kill you? And of course, the technical answer is yes. Raises blood pressure, raises cholesterol, predisposes to heart disease and cardiovascular disease and strokes and so on. But it kills energy, it kills spirit, it kills engagement, it kills morale, and it kills productivity, performance and productivity. So the irony is that when you push people this hard, you get less out of them anyway. So, it's a no-win situation, and that's the way I looked at it. Now, just not to go on too long with this answer, but what I did, I looked at what I thought were all the sources of workplace stress that I was learning from clients and from patients, and I made a list. There was about 12 of them,
Wow.
including technology and rapid change and so on, and bad bosses. But I narrowed it down to what I called the big three: the volume of work, sheer volume of work, the velocity of work, the pace, the speed of the workplace has speeded up dramatically in the last 20 years. And the third thing is abuse in the workplace, which is not being talked about nearly enough. And interestingly, the patients that I end up seeing for the longest period of time are the ones where their biggest problem in the workplace is that they're being harassed, intimidated, bullied, and so on. And so volume, velocity, and use in the workplace. Those are the big three that need to be addressed.
Yeah, this definitely sounds like a huge problem. So, what can employees and employers do to become better at managing this stress in the workplace and
Well,
like forming a better work environment overall?
yeah, well, and that's the important question, of course, is that, you've got to set out what are the problems, but people are looking for solutions. And the book is full of solutions, actually. But I think the first thing to say is that we need to be more aware of what's happening and admit that it's happening and acknowledge it. The second thing is we need to talk about it. It's a lot of this stuff is under the radar. People talk about it to their friends and family, but it's not talked about at work, and it needs to be. It needs to be out there in the open.
Mhm.
So then we talk about, I think what needs to be talked about is the whole issue of work volume. So let's start with that. I think employers need to look at the match between the amount of work and the number of people who are being asked to do it. So first of all, to organize and prioritize the work. And not keep overloading people. There's a great saying, expression, add one, subtract one. I think it's from John Naisbitt. I read this originally. So and I do this with my assistant all the time. When I ask her to do something, I mean, I help her prioritize. But when I ask her to do something, I say, can you do this now and set that aside? Because a lot of people have trouble saying no, especially to their boss. So I think it's incumbent on the boss to say, I want you to do this, or this is a new project or whatever, leave that aside for now.
Mhm.
rather than you've got all that going on. Well, here's one more. So managing the workload that way. The second thing is to excuse me, to be a little more efficient. I'm sorry. In terms of what I call productivity myths. One of the myths that I talk about in terms of workload, um, the next thing I think we need to look at is how much work is unnecessary anyway.
Right.
There's a wonderful book called Fake Work, pretty compelling title. I grabbed that book immediately when I saw it in the bookstore. But fake work, the kind of work that is either redundant because it's duplicating work done by others. It's doing work that people aren't going to look at anyway. Doing work that's not aligned with the strategic goals of the organization. And the authors of that book, Nielsen and Peterson, did surveys all over, I think, America. And they asked, how much of your work do you feel is unnecessary, unimportant, and so on? And the answer they kept getting was over 50%.
Wow.
More than half of the work I'm being asked to do doesn't feel like it has any meaning or value to the organization anyway, if anybody's even going to look at it. So reducing the amount of work that's really not critical work, and that's about prioritizing, but a lot of that stuff should be just taken off the table altogether. Another thing is let's get rid of some of the extraneous things like meetings. Fewer meetings, shorter meetings. Meetings are the bane of every workplace, it seems. But another thing is overuse of technology. Emails and texts and so on. People are just drowning in that stuff. I mean, some people, their whole goal, on a work day is to get through their inbox, much less get to the work that they're supposed to be doing. All that stuff should be managed from the top, and let's, just start to cut back on that. But another thing, excuse me, is we need to discourage long hours. In the workplace. People need to avoid long hours, but the best place for that to start is from the boss.
Right.
And in fact, I use the term, I coined the term, the power of permission. Bosses can have a wonderful impact on employees and give them permission to do things they wouldn't do for themselves. I had a patient who was working till about 7:30 at night. And which I questioned, like, she was starting at about 8 or 9 in the morning. But it was her boss who said to her, Laura, I want you out of here at 6 o'clock every night. I do not want you here half your evening. And he handed her an hour and a half a day, that's 7.5 hours a week of discretionary time at home that she couldn't give herself permission to take. That's good leadership. But avoiding long hours, and by the way, everything that I talk about is applicable to employees and their employers. Bosses, managers, executives, they're all working long, crazy hours too.
Mhm.
I designed a diagram I have a whiteboard here in my office years ago. I call it the inefficiency cycle. And it goes like this: the 12 o'clock position, fatigue. When you are tired, you are less efficient. Okay. And so when you are less efficient, you end up working longer hours. And when you work longer hours, you have less time for, self-care, if you will. So that's sleep, exercise, hobbies, leisure, time with friends and family, which keeps you tired, less efficient, working long hours, and so on. So I have for over 30 years been giving my patients permission and direction to start cutting back on their work hours, mostly the overtime hours, evenings and weekends. And some of them look at me like I'm loopy, like, how am I supposed to do that? I can't even get the work done now. And I show them that past a certain point, when you are tired and inefficient, it's taking longer to do everything anyway. So the irony is the things we cut back on are the things would be most helpful, sleep, exercise, and so on. And excuse me. So the problem is it just perpetuates the cycle. So the deal is that I make though, is that it's not about leaving work earlier or not working in the evening and then doing more home chores. You have to give yourself time for things that nurture you. So again, more sleep. I mean, so mundane. Everybody knows this stuff, but they're not doing it. So more sleep, regular exercise, 4 or 5 times a week, good nutrition, timeouts, for leisure, for hobbies, for socializing, for entertainment, and so on. Never once in over 30 years have I had a patient who couldn't get the same amount of work done in less time when they took better care of themselves. And I get endorsements all the time. I find I'm more productive when I'm working fewer hours, that kind of thing. So my motto is sometimes less is more. Anybody who's working more than 50 hours a week, I think, is fooling themselves. So these are some of the things, and of course the pace of things, and using technology. I had a woman tell me at one of my seminars that when she first started her job, her boss handed her a BlackBerry. This was a number of years ago. Handed her a BlackBerry and said, "I want to be able to get a hold of you anytime," like 24/7 actually. That afternoon, he sent her an email. 10 minutes later, he sent her a text to say, "Did you get my email?" And 10 minutes after that, he phoned her and said, "Where are you?" She said, "That was my first day of work." We've got to stop overusing technology. People are not only drowning in it, but it's actually very, very stressful to try to keep up. And every time the thing goes off, you have to, there's a ping, I have to pay attention to it. So those are a number of things. I guess the only 2 other things are, first of all, realistic deadlines. I used to hear stories about tight deadlines. Then it was unrealistic deadlines, and then it was impossible deadlines. People are just being asked to, boom, 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 fast, fast, fast. Everybody's so impatient, and the problem with that, again, is that it just ramps up the stress level dramatically. And I guess the last thing is to talk about things like sleep and work-life balance and so on. These are things that should be talked about in the workplace and encouraged. And another thing, by the way, is to discourage multitasking. It's so interesting. Some people are actually asked in their interviews, how good are you at multitasking? Multitasking, first of all, is physiologically impossible to do 2 things at exactly the same time. But it impairs productivity and performance dramatically. So we need to start talking about these ideas in the workplace. And one of the best places to get suggestions is ask employees. Sometimes they're asked to fill out, surveys and so on, and they make suggestions. And they're the people who know best what would be more efficient, because they're the ones who are dealing with the frustrations and the obstacles, and so on. And they often see solutions. I sometimes in my seminars say, what are some suggestions you can make for handling the workload better? And like I'll do maybe a 5 or 7 minute table exercise, and then we gather the information in 5 or 7 minutes. They come up with half a dozen really good suggestions. So the best people to ask are the people who know, because they're the people in the front lines dealing with the issues as well. So that's a lot that can be done to solve some of these problems. And by the way, the last one, hire more people. If you've got that much work, that's great news for your company. And by the way, during a pandemic, this is a little more problematic. But the point is that if your workload is high enough that people are working, 45, 50, 55 hours a week, just hire more people.
Yeah. But based on your research and findings, are people more prone to become stressed at their workplace compared to previous decades? Like you're talking about how everything is so fast and, deadlines and everything. Is there a reason, on the employer's perspective that this is happening, or are people just becoming more vocal about it as maybe they weren't back then?
I think it's both. I think the problems have definitely increased. The first presentation I was ever asked to give on managing change, because there was so much technological change in the mid-1990s. Okay, so that was about 25 years ago. when I look back at that, excuse me, people were talking about, fax machines, and they were talking about, these new things that were just starting to be used. You get a cell phone that was as big as a brick that would sit in your car and stuff like that. So the technology has ramped up the speed. I mean, it's at warp speed, really is. And physiologically, we can't handle that. What's really interesting, I coined a phrase a number of years ago. Our jobs have become open-ended in many cases. I mean, if you're working in a factory, you're working on a line or something. But a lot of certainly knowledge work has become open-ended. But we're limited by our physiology. You can only go so fast. You can only work so many hours, with full concentration. You need a certain amount of sleep. You need to eat with some regularity and so on. So what is being done now with technology is to push people to work faster and to try to absorb more information more quickly and respond and so on. Not respond, react. Physiologically, that's not how we're designed. And so people are just, floundering, trying to keep up with all of this, the pace, the technology, but also the expectations and the impatience. I told you the story about this woman's boss after you handed her a BlackBerry.
Mhm.
I mean, that's not good for anybody. And so I think the problems are very real. But the other thing, by the way, was downsizing, which also started in the mid 90s. And so fewer people were asked to do more work. But the other thing, the good news, I think, is that people are now really talking about it. First of all, they're reeling. People are going off on stress leave and absenteeism and high turnover and so on. None of this is good for productivity in an organization. But people are now starting to talk about it more. And there's less stigma. The younger generations now are pretty comfortable talking about the fact that they're on meds or, getting therapy and so on. I think that's very healthy because, this stuff was all kind of quiet and, we didn't talk about this and it was under the radar, but it was still happening. And so I think the problems are real. And I think that the fact that people are talking about them more is a good thing. And they are talking about it more.
Do you think that, amidst the pandemic and post-pandemic and everything, a lot of people are working more at home now? Do you think that is better for people, or do you think it actually makes them more stressed?
Well, that's a great question. And the answer, I think, is both, depending on the person. Some people are flourishing by working from home, and others are floundering because, first of all, it's harder to set boundaries between your work, and housework, and family time, and so on and so on, when it's all in the same place. Some people don't even have a separate room. They don't have the option to have a separate room to work in.
Mm-hmm.
So they're working on the kitchen table or something like that. For other people, if they have the luxury of, first of all, working from home, actually, for most people, is still a luxury. It's tremendous time saving. I've got patients who are saving 2 hours a day in commuting time, plus hundreds of dollars a month in commuting costs. But also, it gives them more time, for leisure and family and so on, if they choose to use it. But some people can't set boundaries. They're finding it very difficult. And what's interesting is that, extroverts need more social interaction and so on than introverts. Introverts still do too, by the way. I mean, it's just that they can get overloaded when there's too much. But some people are really craving the social interaction, and understandably they miss it. So working from home, I think, is a double-edged sword, and for some people it's good news, and for some people, and of course the whole issue of cabin fever. We just come through the winter, so that's not been easy either.
Right. Yeah. No, that's definitely really interesting. Those are all the questions that I have for you today. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
I'd like to actually editorialize about one thing, and that's abuse in the workplace. It's a huge problem, and it's rarely acknowledged and dealt with. In most organizations, they know who the bullies are. They, you know, around the water cooler, they can pick that up. And by the way, if they don't know, they should know.
Mhm.
They need to make it their business to know. But you know, watch how morale increases when that particular person's on vacation. Watch how many people are applying for transfers to other departments. Watch the turnover in that particular, you know, the expression, people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses. And by the way, not all the abusers are bosses, because they can be, you know, people higher on the, you know, horizontal or even working below who are still causing a lot of problems. Um, but I think we're talking about harassment, we're talking about intimidation and bullying, and it needs to be identified and needs to stop. Now, what always mystified me is I understand that bad behavior can happen. I mean, sometimes it's just people not handling their own stress very well, as I mentioned before. But what I don't understand is why do they get away with it? Why are the people, the victims, having to go for therapy, go on medications, go on, sometimes even be hospitalized, go on stress leave, while the perpetrators just carry on very happily and people turn a blind eye? Why aren't they sent for anger management, you know, diversity training, sensitivity training, management skills? A lot of people move into management without much training. So my message here is that, you know, the way I say it is find them and either fix them or fire them.
Mm.
Identify who these people are and then work with them. Say, look, we understand that there's some things going on. We'd like to work with you. We'd like to send you some, you know, maybe some training courses and so on. But you're going to be on probation, and we are going to watch for progress. So you don't have to, you know, throw them out the door right away. But if they are reluctant to change or was, you know, simply, well, I haven't done anything wrong, you know, that kind of thing, I think you need to show them the door because they're more trouble than they're worth.
Right.
And what's happening is that one person can intimidate an entire, you know, department. I don't know, but I can't remember how many years ago, I had a patient who was being harassed by her boss. Okay, and within weeks, two, three, four more people showed up, you know, asking for appointments, talking about being harassed at work. And guess what? They were all working for the same boss.
Oh my
So
God.
one person was ruining about 5 lives, and that's got to stop.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's very interesting when somebody is finally shown the door. I've heard this from patients, and he said morale just flourished after that. Everybody was practically cheering.
Hmm.
People know what's going on, but it's not being addressed, and it needs to be. Um, and my last comment, by the way, is that I think the whole issue of workplace stress is affecting everybody. But I think that everybody is a stakeholder, and so everybody can have, first of all, needs to take responsibility for the solutions, but also has the opportunity to contribute to the solutions.
Right.
So it's not all on the employer and it's not all on the employee, but together as a shared responsibility, they can create healthier, happier, and ultimately far more productive workplaces. The kind that people want to work in, the kind that people want to stay working in, and want to encourage their friends. Why don't you apply? There's an opening in our company. It's a great place to work. It's a shared responsibility. It's a win-win-win when it's addressed properly.
Right. Yeah. No, I completely agree. And workplace stress is such an important topic since, most people have to cope with some type of stress in the workplace environment. So thank you so much for explaining all these concepts and, coping mechanisms. I'm sure our audience will really appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me, Dove, and thank you for introducing me to the program that you have started because I think it's terrific. So I wish you well with it.
Great. Thank you.